The moment I realized the hatch wouldn't budge, my stomach dropped harder than during launch. We had just docked Soyuz 10 to Salyut 1, the world's first space station, our great Soviet triumph. On the ground, they were already preparing speeches. The newspapers would call us pioneers. I was ready to float inside, take that first breath of the station's recycled air. But the hatch wouldn't move. I pulled. Alexei pulled. Nikolai swore under his breath and tried from another angle. Nothing. The docking probe had jammed. We were locked to the station like a barnacle, but the door between us might as well have been welded shut. I remember Nikolai looking at me with wide eyes through his helmet visor. He was the rookie, but his expression said what we were all thinking: we might not be able to get out. We might never get back. Try again. Harder, I said. My voice cracked more than I wanted. We tried again. Still nothing. And that was the first time it hit me: we were circling 200 miles above Earth, clinging to the outside of humanity's newest home in space, and we couldn't even get in. The first minutes after we docked were full of relief. The guidance system had worked, our alignment was steady, and the mechanical arms had pulled us into contact with Salyut 1. I reported to Mission Control that the automatic sequence was complete, and they confirmed the station had registered our arrival. In theory, the next step was simple: depressurize the orbital module of our Soyuz, open the internal hatch, then move through into the station's docking compartment. But when I tried to turn the hatch handle, it resisted. At first, I thought it was just stiffness from the pressure difference, which sometimes happened in training. I pulled harder, expecting to hear the familiar metallic clank of the locks disengaging. Nothing moved. Alexei leaned forward, wedged his gloved hands against the rim of the hatch, and gave it a strong twist. He had a reputation for being physically tough, and if anyone could muscle it open, it was him. The handle didn't move a millimeter. Nikolai suggested we cycle the pressure again to make sure it was equalized. We ran the procedure carefully, watching the gauges until they matched what we expected. He tapped the dial with his finger, as if he didn't believe what he saw, then nodded that the pressure was balanced. We tried the hatch again. Nothing. The cabin was too small for us not to notice the tension growing. Every movement was loud in the silence: Velcro tearing, buckles clinking, the hiss of our suits. Finally, Alexei said in a flat voice, "It's not the pressure. It's mechanical." The words hung there. Mechanical meant something physical was jammed or bent, and there was no way to replace parts 200 miles above Earth. I radioed to ground: hatch not opening. Resistance in the mechanism. There was a pause, longer than usual. Then the voice of the flight controller came back, calm but clipped: "Repeat attempt. Do not use excessive force." It was the kind of advice you give when you have no real advice. We repeated the attempt. Nikolai braced himself against the panel and tried the handle, sweat floating in tiny droplets from his forehead. He swore again, louder this time, and punched the hatch frame with his glove. The sound was dull, like hitting a pipe with a wrench. He looked at me, waiting for direction, but I had no better ideas than he did. I just said, "Calm down. Try again." The ground came back after a few minutes with new instructions. We were to try redocking manually, to see if realignment would help disengage the locks. That meant undocking from Salyut 1, backing away a few meters, and then attempting to connect again with manual control. It was delicate work. I had trained countless times in simulators for this, but never with a station the size of Salyut waiting in front of me. The thought of scraping against its hull or misaligning the probe made my stomach tighten. Still, we had no choice. We initiated the undocking. The latches released correctly, and Soyuz floated free. For a moment, I saw the station through the small porthole, a long cylinder against the blackness, our prize, unreachable. I aligned the controls and brought us forward slowly. The probe extended, we made contact, and again the capture latches pulled us tight. The indicators glowed green. I could almost believe it had worked. I turned the hatch handle. It moved a fraction, then stopped as if welded in place. Alexei muttered, "Same problem." I felt my hands shaking slightly. I pressed them against the panel to steady myself. "Report to ground, docking complete, hatch still jammed." The pause before the controller answered was longer this time, and when he spoke, his voice was lower. "Understood. Repeat procedures." That meant keep trying, even though we all knew the outcome would be the same. We tried for almost 2 hours. The hatch refused every attempt. The cabin grew hot with our body heat, and the smell of metal and sweat was thick in the air. At one point, Nikolai said quietly, "We're just stuck here, aren't we? Docked to the station, but not inside it." No one answered him. We didn't have the energy. At last, Moscow called us again. "Comrades, the docking probe has malfunctioned. It cannot be disengaged from the station side. You must prepare for return." There was silence in our cabin after that, longer than any before. All the weeks of training, the pride of being the first crew to enter an orbital station, the history we had imagined making, it was over, and it ended with a single piece of metal not doing its job. I looked at Alexei, and he looked back with the same anger I felt. "We came all this way for nothing," he said. Nikolai closed his eyes and leaned back, saying nothing. For him, it was his first spaceflight. I couldn't imagine the disappointment crushing him at that moment. For me, it was not my first mission, but it was easily the bitterest. The instructions from ground were clear now: we had to undock permanently and return to Earth. But even that carried a risk. The probe mechanism was stuck, and if it refused to release completely, we could be trapped against the station until our systems failed. That possibility was not said aloud by the controllers, but I knew they were thinking it. We all were. When I gave the command to release, I held my breath. The indicators flickered, then turned green. Soyuz separated from Salyut 1 with a gentle push. I felt a wave of relief so strong my legs shook in their restraints. But the relief was mixed with a hollow feeling, because the separation meant our mission was effectively over. I reported to Moscow, "Soyuz is free." There was cheering in the background of the radio, which faded quickly once the reality sank in. We were free, yes, but drifting home in failure. At that moment, the critical discovery was not just that the hatch was jammed. It was the realization that sometimes, even in space, history comes down to the failure of a single mechanism. The cabin had gone quiet except for the steady hiss of the fans and the occasional creak of the hull as the temperature outside shifted while we orbited. The official order from ground was clear: return home. But we were not ready to let it go that easily. Alexei was the first to break the silence. He turned toward me, his face pale and glistening with sweat under the helmet. "We can't just leave, Vladimir. We trained for months. They built this station for us. If we go back without entering, it will be a humiliation." His voice was steady, but I heard the bitterness in it. He had worked directly with the engineers on some of the docking systems. He took this failure almost personally. Nikolai floated near the panel, staring at the indicator lights as if they would change if he looked hard enough. "If we keep trying, maybe the latches will release after enough cycles," he said. His tone was uncertain, but there was a desperation in his suggestion. He was the youngest, only 38, and this was his first flight. The idea of returning without setting foot in the station must have felt like his career ending before it had really begun. I understood that feeling, but I also understood the risk. Every additional attempt meant burning more fuel and increasing the chance of damaging our ship, which was already our only way back to Earth. I contacted ground again. "Mission Control, crew requests permission for repeated manual docking attempts." The response came after a long pause, and it was not what my crew wanted to hear. "Negative. Systems show risk of failure increasing. Return is priority. Prepare for descent." The voice was calm, but I could tell they were worried about losing us entirely if we pushed the mechanism too far. Alexei slammed his gloved fist against the console, sending a hollow vibration through the cabin. They don't understand, they're not here. We came all this way to test the station. If we just leave, what was the point? His breathing was heavy, fogging the inside of his visor. Nikolai turned sharply to me. Commander, we should insist. We can try once more at least. What's the harm? I had to keep my composure, but the pressure in my chest was building. The harm is if the probe jams completely. Then we cannot undock, and we die attached to that station. Do you want that? The words came out harsher than I intended. Nikolai recoiled slightly, as if struck. He lowered his eyes and muttered, "No, of course not." Alexei, however, was not convinced. We cannot be the crew that fails the first station mission. You know how it will look, Vladimir. The Americans will laugh, and our own people will ask why we even launched. History will not remember the technical excuse. I floated there, listening to him, feeling the weight of his argument. He was right about how it would look. We were supposed to make headlines, to show the world that the Soviet Union was still ahead in spaceflight after the moon landings. Instead, we were preparing to return home with nothing to show except that we had touched the outside of the station. But I also knew what he was not admitting: history would remember us as dead men if we tried too hard and broke the ship. The argument escalated when ground called again. Soyuz 10, confirm you are preparing for retrofire sequence. Alexei ripped his headset away in frustration and shouted across the cabin before I could even respond. Tell them no. Tell them we demand to try again. His face was red, and his voice cracked. Nikolai nodded in agreement, though he was quieter, almost pleading. Just once more, Commander. If it doesn't work, we'll stop. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a breath. The cabin air was stale and hot now, and I felt the sweat running down my back. My mind raced. I was responsible for their lives, but also for the mission. Both of them looked at me, waiting, desperate for me to side with them against ground. I opened the channel. Mission Control, crew requests reconsideration of one additional manual attempt. The reply came fast this time. Request denied. Immediate preparations for return are required. Oxygen supply margin is narrowing. That was the argument that ended the discussion. None of us could deny the gauges. We had already consumed more oxygen than planned in our repeated efforts. Another failed docking would push us into dangerous territory. I looked at Alexei, who shook his head in anger, then at Nikolai, whose expression had collapsed into disappointment. You heard them, I said firmly. We are going back. For several minutes after that, no one spoke. Only the sounds of switches clicking as I began to set up the retrofire sequence. Then Alexei finally muttered, almost to himself but loud enough for us to hear, we were supposed to be the first to enter. Now we're nothing. His bitterness was sharp. I wanted to tell him that survival was not nothing, that many crews had died chasing firsts, but I kept silent. Nikolai, on the other hand, whispered, it's not over. There will be other flights. Someone will enter. At least we tried. His attempt at comfort fell flat. Alexei didn't respond. When ground asked for confirmation of our preparations again, I answered with a tone I forced to be calm, though inside I felt the same frustration as my crew. Soyuz 10 is preparing retrofire. The silence that followed felt heavy, as if even the controllers on Earth were mourning what the mission had become. Inside our small capsule, 3 men floated, each fighting his own storm. One furious at failure, one crushed by disappointment, and one carrying the responsibility of choosing between pride and survival. We had confronted the crisis, but the confrontation had not been with the station or the hatch. It had been between us, our desire to make history and the harsh reality that space does not forgive mistakes. The decision was final. We were returning to Earth. There was no chance of another attempt, no chance of forcing the hatch, no chance of salvaging the mission. That meant our focus had to turn to survival, because in space, even coming home is never routine. I began by running through the descent preparation checklist, forcing my voice to remain steady as I read the steps aloud for confirmation. Alexei responded curtly, his tone clipped, his movements sharp as he worked the switches. Nikolai floated silently, following instructions without argument, but I could see the defeat in his eyes every time he glanced toward the station drifting outside the porthole. The station was right there, so close that we could see the sunlight glinting along its surface, and yet it was as unreachable as if it were on another planet. We initiated the separation sequence. Soyuz was made of 3 sections, the orbital module at the front, the descent module in the middle where we sat, and the service module at the rear. Only the descent module was designed to survive re-entry. Everything else had to be jettisoned before we hit the atmosphere. I gave the command, and the system triggered the explosive bolts. A loud metallic crack echoed through the cabin, followed by a slight jolt as the modules separated. For a moment, it seemed normal, but then the indicator panel failed to show a clean separation of the service module. I stared at the lights, waiting for the confirmation that never came. Service module still attached, I reported. My stomach tightened. If the service module failed to detach, the descent module would not have the correct aerodynamic profile. Instead of re-entering nose first with the heat shield absorbing the fiery plasma, the capsule could tumble uncontrollably, tearing apart in the upper atmosphere. Mission Control responded quickly. Understood. Attempt separation again. Alexei was already resetting the sequence, his hands moving with urgency. He triggered the system a second time. Another jolt, another crack. Still the indicator glowed red. For the next 20 minutes, we cycled through every procedure we knew, commanding separation again and again. Each time the same result. The service module refused to let go. The cabin grew hotter as the electronics and our own bodies raised the temperature. I felt sweat dripping down the sides of my face, stinging my eyes. Nikolai asked quietly, "What if it doesn't separate at all?" His voice was flat, but the meaning was clear. If it didn't separate, we were finished. I forced myself to keep calm. It will separate. The pyros have redundancy. We keep trying. Ground gave us additional instructions, some of them repeated, as if they hoped repetition alone would make the mechanism obey. At one point, Alexei shouted into the microphone, "We've tried. It's not working." His frustration boiled over, but I placed a hand on his arm to steady him. "Stay focused," I said sharply. He glared at me but nodded. I could see his anger was not only at the machine but at the entire situation, his pride and effort collapsing into this humiliating struggle to get home. Finally, after another attempt, there was a violent shudder, harder than before. The whole capsule lurched, and we heard the sound of metal tearing away. The indicator switched to green. The service module had finally separated. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Nikolai exhaled loudly and said, "Thank God." Alexei just shook his head, muttering something under his breath I couldn't catch. I reported the separation to ground, and this time the controller's voice carried audible relief. "Copy. Begin orientation for retrofire." The burn was scheduled on the next orbit. I took manual control to orient the capsule, lining up the gyroscopes with the proper re-entry angle. Too steep and we would burn up. Too shallow and we would skip off the atmosphere like a stone and drift into space until the air ran out. The math had been done on the ground, but it was my hands on the controls. Alexei read out the numbers, and Nikolai confirmed the alignment. When the retrofire command was given, the engines ignited with a deep vibration that rattled through our seats. The deceleration pressed us into the cushions, and for the first time since docking, I felt the reassuring weight of gravity return, even if only slightly. As the engines cut off, we drifted into silence again. This was the most dangerous part. We were locked on course for the atmosphere, and now all we could do was wait. The earth filled the window, the curvature bright with scattered clouds. Nikolai whispered, "I hope it holds." I didn't answer. My thoughts were on the heat shield beneath us, the bolts that had just barely separated, the fragile systems that had to work perfectly to get us home. The descent began with the first faint tremors, then quickly grew violent. The capsule shook as we slammed into the upper layers of atmosphere at orbital speed. Plasma built up outside, and through the small porthole, I saw the glow, first a faint orange, then a blinding red. The cabin roared with noise, as if we were trapped inside a furnace. Every vibration felt like a threat, every jolt like the start of a breakup. Alexei gripped the straps across his chest and shouted over the noise, "Hold together, damn it." Nikolai squeezed his eyes shut, his lips moving silently as if he were praying. I held the control stick, though in truth, at this stage, there was little I could do. The capsule either worked as designed, or it didn't. The G-forces grew quickly. My body felt heavier with each passing second, pressing me into the seat. Breathing became difficult, each inhalation forced. Sweat poured down my face, but I couldn't move to wipe it away. The roar was deafening, and the cabin smelled of hot metal and our own exertion. In those moments, the arguments about pride and history vanished. All that mattered was survival. The capsule shook violently one last time, then stabilized. The G-forces eased slightly. Outside the porthole, the glow began to fade. I realized we had passed the most dangerous phase. We were still alive. I managed to whisper into the microphone, "Re-entry nominal." My voice sounded hoarse, almost broken. The response from ground was drowned out by static, but I didn't care. We had made it through. As the parachutes deployed, the capsule jerked again. The noise shifted from the roar of plasma to the loud flapping of canvas. The descent slowed, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself a deep breath. The step-by-step actions, the tension of each command, the fear that every system might betray us, it had brought us back to Earth's atmosphere. We weren't safe yet, but we had survived the attempt. The parachutes had deployed, but none of us relaxed completely. Every Soyuz veteran knew the landing was still violent, and the step between survival and disaster remained narrow until we were firmly on the ground. As we descended, the cabin creaked under the strain of the parachute lines, and the swaying was rough enough to make us feel like we were being shaken inside a box. My headset crackled with the voice of mission control, distorted but clear enough, "Soyuz 10, trajectory nominal. Estimated landing zone within range of recovery teams. Prepare for impact sequence." I acknowledged, but my voice sounded flat, drained of emotion. The three of us had been through too much to celebrate yet. Alexei leaned his head back against the cushion and spoke with a bitterness that filled the small cabin. "So this is it. We return home with nothing but a report that says the hatch did not open." He laughed once, without humor. "The Americans will be reading the details before we've even taken off our suits." His words cut through the cabin, and I knew he meant them to sting. He was furious that all the training and effort had come to this, and he could not let go of the idea that history would remember us as a failed crew. Nikolai finally broke his silence, his voice trembling as much as the capsule. "We didn't fail, Alexei. We reached the station. We proved it could be launched, it could be occupied. If the mechanism failed, that's not on us." His words were more for himself than for Alexei, but the attempt at optimism felt hollow. I saw his hands trembling as he gripped the straps across his chest. It was his first mission, and the thought that he might never fly again weighed heavily on him. He wanted to believe the effort still mattered, but deep down, he feared that his career would be remembered only for this flawed mission. I cut in, trying to stop the argument before it worsened. "Listen to me. We are alive. That is all that matters right now. We will land, and we will walk out of this capsule. The rest is politics. Let the engineers and the officials explain the failure. Our job was to survive the flight and report what happened, and we did that." My words were calm, but even as I said them, I felt the hollow echo of compromise. I knew Alexei was right in one way. The program's reputation had been dealt a serious blow, and our names would be tied to it. Still, I could not allow despair to rule the cabin during the last minutes of our descent. The voice of mission control returned, instructing us to prepare for impact. Brace positions, 60 seconds. The straps pulled tight across my body as I adjusted, pressing my chin to my chest and locking my arms in front. The cabin shook harder now, air whistling across the hull. Alexei muttered under his breath, 60 seconds until we hit the ground like a stone. Nikolai whispered, I hope the retro-rockets fire. I said nothing, just focused on my breathing, waiting for the inevitable. During those last seconds, I spoke quietly into the microphone, not just for the ground but for myself. This is Soyuz 10. Crew is ready for landing. We will see the Earth again in moments. I felt a sudden rush of sadness at those words, not for myself but for what could have been. I had imagined these final minutes differently, reporting proudly that we had entered the first space station, describing what we saw and how it felt. Instead, I was speaking like a survivor returning from an incomplete journey. The impact came with a brutal jolt that slammed us against the seats, followed by a heavy thud as the retro-rockets fired at the last moment to soften the landing. Even with them, it felt like crashing into solid concrete. My teeth clacked together, and pain shot through my back. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. Then the capsule settled, tilting slightly on its side. Silence returned, broken only by our labored breathing. We were down. Alexei cursed loudly, then unstrapped himself with stiff movements. Nikolai rubbed his chest where the straps had dug deep. I reported to ground in a hoarse voice, Soyuz 10 has landed. The confirmation came quickly, followed by the announcement that recovery forces were en route. Outside, faint thuds echoed through the hull, likely the sound of wind pushing the capsule against the Earth. As we waited for recovery, the cabin atmosphere grew even more suffocating. The smell of burnt metal from re-entry lingered, mixed with sweat and the acrid scent of the suit materials. Alexei spoke again, his voice low but firm. You know what they will say, Vladimir. They will call it the first mission to the station, and then they will whisper that the crew failed. That is how it will be remembered. His eyes were fixed on me, demanding an answer. I met his gaze. They can say what they want. But if we had pushed harder and died up there, there would be no mission to remember at all. The program would have stalled. Someone else will enter that station. And they will succeed because we showed where the weakness was. My words carried conviction because they had to. I could not let my crew sink into despair while we were still strapped inside the capsule. Nikolai, quieter now, said, do you think they will let me fly again? His question hung in the air. Neither Alexei nor I answered immediately. We knew how the program worked. Failures had a way of ending careers, even when the fault was not with the crew. I finally said, if they are wise, they will. You did everything right. But it is not our decision. He nodded slowly, though I could see the doubt remained in his eyes. We sat in silence until the sound of helicopters grew louder outside. Sunlight flickered through the window as recovery crews approached. The last conversation inside the capsule had been raw, filled with anger, disappointment, and the fragile attempts to find meaning in failure. It was the final act of our mission, and it was not triumph or pride that filled the cabin, but the sober realization of how close we had come to disaster and how little glory there was in simply surviving. When the recovery crews opened the hatch, the rush of cold steppe air hit us immediately. It smelled of dust, grass, and smoke from the helicopters circling nearby. After days of breathing nothing but the recycled air of Soyuz, it was overwhelming. Hands reached inside, pulling us out one by one. My legs, unaccustomed to gravity after only 2 days in orbit, trembled as they tried to hold my weight. 2 soldiers supported me under the arms while medics checked my pulse. Alexei came out next, still scowling, brushing off the help as if his anger gave him strength. Nikolai emerged last, blinking at the daylight, his face pale and his body stiff. We stood together on the Kazakh steppe, our mission over, with the silent bulk of the charred descent module behind us. The officials arrived quickly. Some shook our hands, congratulated us on our safe return, and spoke of the importance of the data we had gathered. Their words sounded practiced, almost mechanical, as though they were reading from a prepared script. I knew what they were avoiding saying, that we had not entered the station, that the docking mechanism had failed, that history's first space station remained unoccupied. The questions about the mission would come later, in closed rooms where the public could not hear, but already I sensed how our story would be shaped. Survival would be praised in the official reports, but in the unspoken judgment, we would be remembered as the crew that had not succeeded. That evening, after the examinations and the endless debriefings, we were allowed a few hours of rest. I lay on a narrow cot in the recovery facility, staring at the ceiling. My body ached from the landing, but it was not the pain that kept me awake. It was the weight of disappointment. I thought of the months of training, the long hours spent practicing every scenario in the simulators, the careful rehearsals of docking procedures, the pride of knowing we would be the first to inhabit Salyut 1. All of that had vanished in a few hours of failed attempts and a single stuck mechanism. I heard Alexei in the next room arguing with one of the officials, his voice raised, demanding that the engineers explain how such a flaw could have been allowed. Nikolai, I was told, had not spoken much at all. He sat quietly with the doctors, answering questions with one-word replies, lost in his own thoughts. The next morning, we were taken back to Moscow. There were photographers waiting, and we were instructed to smile for the cameras. We stood in our flight suits, stiff and tired, while the flashes went off. Officially, the line was that Soyuz 10 had been a test mission that provided valuable data about docking procedures. Privately, we knew it was being called a failure, and in the corners of the press hall, I caught the whispers from the journalists, they didn't even enter. The reality was clear. No speeches, no triumph, only carefully chosen words to hide the disappointment. In the weeks that followed, we went through endless interrogations with engineers and program officials. They asked us to describe every detail, every movement of the hatch handle, every sound we heard, every indicator light we saw. I repeated the same account until I could recite it in my sleep. Alexei grew angrier with each session, sometimes slamming his fist on the table, demanding answers. Nikolai remained quiet, his eyes often on the floor. I noticed the change in him. Before the flight, he had been eager, full of energy. Afterward, he seemed older, more withdrawn. He told me once, late at night in the dormitory, I think this was my only flight. They won't send me again. I tried to reassure him, but I knew he was right. The program had little tolerance for failure, even when the failure was mechanical. As for myself, I carried the weight differently. I had already flown before, and I understood that spaceflight was as much about survival as achievement. I tried to see the mission as a lesson, one that would help future crews succeed where we had been stopped. Yet in quiet moments, I could not escape the thought that we had been so close. Salyut 1 had been right there, locked to our ship, waiting for us. I imagined floating through its compartments, testing its systems, reporting proudly that the first space station was operational. Instead, I could only describe how the hatch handle refused to turn. 2 months later, the next crew launched aboard Soyuz 11. They succeeded where we had not. They entered Salyut 1, lived aboard it, and proved that an orbital station could function. But tragedy followed them. A leak during re-entry killed all 3 cosmonauts, making them the only humans to die in space itself. When I heard the news, I sat in silence for a long time. Alexei punched the wall of the office and cursed, tears in his eyes. Nikolai said nothing at all. In that moment, I realized something important. Our failure to enter Salyut 1 had saved our lives. If we had succeeded, if we had stayed aboard the station, perhaps it would have been us in Soyuz 11, and our bodies would have been found lifeless in the steppe. The thought stayed with me, both as a comfort and as a haunting possibility. In the years that followed, I continued my work in the program. There were other missions, other stations, and eventually the long progression that would lead to Mir and the International Space Station. Each success was built on earlier attempts, including our own. I learned to accept that Soyuz 10 would never be remembered as a triumph. It was a footnote, a near miss, a reminder that even the most ambitious dreams are vulnerable to the smallest failure. Yet for me, it was also a reminder of the resilience required to face space and come home alive. When I look back now, what stays with me most is not the anger or the disappointment, but the sound of Alexei's voice demanding we try again, the look in Nikolai's eyes as he whispered his hope to fly once more, and the heavy silence inside the capsule as we realized we had no choice but to return. Those moments revealed who we were, stripped of glory and stripped of success. 3 men, circling above Earth, forced to confront failure and survive it. That was the real mission of Soyuz 10, even if history remembers it differently.